Rio de Janeiro, 1952. A physics professor walks into his university lecture hall and writes a simple question on the board. What makes an angle in a crystal? 80 students stare back. Perfect silence. He tries again, rephrasing. Nothing. These are advanced physics students who just aced their quantum mechanics exam last week. They should know this cold. What Feynman discovered in that classroom would expose a crisis in education that still devastates millions of students today. This comes from Richard Feynman's documented teaching experience in Brazil, recorded in his memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and verified through archives at the Centro Brasileiro de Pesquisas Físicas. The physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize and revolutionize our understanding of quantum mechanics spent nearly 2 years teaching in South America. He expected brilliant minds eager to unlock the mysteries of physics. He found something else entirely. Feynman arrived in Rio in 1951 as a visiting professor, hired to strengthen Brazil's emerging physics program. The university boasted modern facilities, ambitious students, and a curriculum imported directly from America's top institutions. On paper, everything looked promising. The students attended every lecture, took meticulous notes, and spent hours studying in the library. Their exam scores were immaculate, perfect recitation of Maxwell's equations, flawless reproduction of thermodynamic principles. These weren't struggling students, they were academic superstars. But something felt wrong. During his third week, Feynman demonstrated polarized light using 2 calcite crystals. He held them up, rotated one, and watched the light intensity change. Basic optics, first-year material. He asked the class to explain what they were seeing. Blank stares. But you just had a whole semester on electromagnetic waves, Feynman said, genuinely confused. One brave student raised his hand. Professor, we studied electromagnetic waves. We did not study calcite crystals. That's when Feynman began to suspect he wasn't teaching physics. He was witnessing something far more disturbing. A perfect system for preventing learning while maintaining the illusion of education. He designed an experiment. In the next class, he asked students to define Brewster's angle. Hands shot up. They recited the textbook definition word for word, including the mathematical formula. Impressive. Then Feynman asked, "Look at the bay outside this window. Can you see how the light reflects off the water at different angles? Is Brewster's angle happening right now?" The room went silent. They had memorized Brewster's angle so thoroughly they could write essays about it. But they couldn't recognize it happening 30 feet away. This pattern repeated in every topic. Students could recite Newton's laws, but couldn't explain why a bicycle stays upright. They knew the formula for kinetic energy, but looked confused when asked about a ball rolling down a ramp. They had learned physics the way someone might memorize a foreign phrase book without understanding the language. Feynman tried different approaches. He simplified questions. He used real objects instead of abstract symbols. He asked them to predict simple outcomes before calculating anything. Nothing worked. The more he probed, the more obvious it became. His students had spent years studying physics without ever thinking about physics. But here's where the story gets darker. These students weren't lazy. They weren't stupid. They studied harder than most American students Feynman had taught. They spent entire nights memorizing textbooks. Their dedication was absolute. That was precisely the problem. Feynman started investigating the Brazilian education system beyond his classroom. He attended other lectures, reviewed exam papers, talked with students from different universities. What he discovered was a machinery of knowledge destruction operating at industrial scale. Students learned that professors asked questions in predictable patterns, memorize the exact phrasing from textbooks, reproduce it verbatim on exams, and you succeeded. Every incentive pointed toward memorization. Every assessment rewarded recitation. The entire system had evolved to measure the appearance of learning while actively preventing actual understanding. One evening, Feynman met with a group of engineering students preparing for their final exams. He watched them quiz each other. "What is the definition of triboluminescence?" one asked. Another student recited, "Triboluminescence is the light emitted when crystals are crushed." Perfect answer. Textbook definition. Feynman interrupted. "Have any of you ever seen this happen?" Confused looks. "Seen what?" Try bioluminescence, light from crushing crystals. You can do it with sugar cubes in the dark. None of them had. They were memorizing the definition of a phenomenon they'd never witnessed, couldn't imagine, and wouldn't recognize if it happened in front of them. Feynman realized these students were trapped in what he later called cargo cult science. They had all the superficial forms of learning without any of the substance. They possessed the vocabulary of physics, but none of its power. They could pass any test, yet solve no real problems. You've felt this frustration when you've crammed for an exam, aced it, then couldn't remember anything a week later. That hollow feeling when you realize you memorized your way through material without understanding any of it. Feynman students experienced this every single day, but the system told them they were succeeding. This wasn't just about Brazilian education in 1952. This was about the fundamental difference between two types of knowledge: knowledge that decorates the mind versus knowledge that transforms it. The Brazilian students had accumulated facts like decorative objects. Each definition, each formula, each principle sat in their minds as a separate, isolated piece. When asked about Brewster's angle, they retrieved the Brewster's angle fact. When asked about reflection, they retrieved the reflection fact. But these facts never connected. They never formed a web of understanding that could respond to novel situations. Real physicists think differently. They build models, mental simulations of how the world works. When Feynman looked at light reflecting off water, his mind automatically ran physics. Not because he memorized light reflects at Brewster's angle off water, but because he understood electromagnetic waves, understood how they interact with matter, and could predict outcomes from fundamental principles. The students had no models, they had scripts. And scripts only work when reality follows the exact scenarios you've memorized. Feynman confronted this head-on in his final lecture. He stood before the assembled faculty and students and delivered what accounts describe as a devastating critique. He told them their system produced students who pass examinations and pass them pretty well, but in which we do not know anything except what we have memorized. The room erupted in defensive arguments. Professors insisted their methods were sound. Look at the test scores. Students protested that they worked incredibly hard. How dare he suggest they knew nothing? But Feynman wasn't attacking their effort. He was exposing their tragedy. These brilliant minds had invested years in a system designed to prevent them from becoming scientists while convincing them they were succeeding. He put it plainly in a quote that still reverberates through education debates. After a lot of investigation, I finally figured out that the students had memorized everything, but they didn't know what anything meant. Let that sink in. They didn't know what anything meant. Every formula was a magic spell. Every definition was empty words. They could reproduce the entire textbook without comprehending a single concept. This reveals something crucial about how knowledge actually works. Real understanding isn't about storage. It's about transformation. When you truly learn physics, you don't just acquire new facts. You acquire new ways of seeing. Light stops being just light and becomes electromagnetic waves propagating through space. Motion, it stops being just movement and becomes the interplay of forces, energy, and momentum. Feynman's students never experienced this transformation. They treated education as data entry, pour information into brain, retrieve information on demand. But human minds don't work like hard drives. We understand through connection, through application, through watching ideas collide and transform. The same principle applies today when you watch tutorial videos at 2x speed, highlight textbooks in multiple colors, or create elaborate notes you never review. You're building the appearance of learning while avoiding the actual work, grappling with ideas until they yield their meaning. Modern education has perfected the Brazilian system's flaws. We have students who watch lecture videos and feel like they understand, then freeze on the exam. We have professionals who complete certifications without gaining competence. We have entire industries built on courses that provide certificates rather than capabilities. The markers of fake learning are everywhere. Someone can explain a concept to you, but can't answer basic what-if questions. Someone's resume lists impressive credentials, but they can't solve simple problems in their field. Someone has read dozens of books on a topic, but their thinking hasn't changed at all. You recognize this in yourself when you realize you've been studying something for months, but still can't use it. When you need to look up the basics every time. When you can recognize the right answer on a multiple choice test, but couldn't generate it from scratch. Feynman identified the mechanism behind this failure. The Brazilian students weren't building knowledge from the ground up. They were memorizing the finished product. They learned conclusions without premises, results without derivations, formulas without the logic that produced them. It's like trying to understand a building by memorizing a photograph. You might accurately describe what it looks like, but you won't understand why it stands up, how the weight distributes, or what happens if you remove a support beam. Real learning starts with simple questions that demand real thinking. Not define electromagnetic induction, but why does a generator need to spin? Not recite Newton's second law, but predict what happens when I push this cart on a frictionless track. Feynman spent his last months in Brazil trying to demonstrate this approach. He brought broken radios into class and asked students to make them work. No formulas allowed, just think. He took them outside and made them explain ordinary phenomena using physics principles. He banned memorized definitions and demanded explanations in their own words. Some students resisted. This felt harder than memorizing, and it was. Thinking always is. But a few started to break through. They had moments Feynman called the pleasure of finding things out. That electric feeling when understanding clicks and the world suddenly makes sense. Those students learned what it means to know something, not to recite it, not to recognize it, but to command it. To take an idea and turn it over in your mind, test its boundaries, apply it to new situations, and make it yours. Here's what Feynman understood that the Brazilian system missed. Learning is transformation, not accumulation. You don't truly know something until it changes how you see the world, until you can't look at a rainbow without thinking about refraction, until you can't watch a ball drop without seeing acceleration, until the knowledge becomes automatic, instinctive, part of how your mind operates. This is why cramming fails. Why highlighting fails. Why passive note-taking fails. You're trying to accumulate when you need to transform. You're decorating your mind when you need to rewire it. The students who break through are the ones who stop asking, "What should I memorize?" and start asking, "What would happen if..." They're the ones who close the textbook and try to rederive concepts from scratch, who attempt problems before looking at solutions, who teach others and discover their own gaps. They're willing to feel stupid temporarily because they understand that confusion is the raw material of learning. That struggle is where transformation happens. That the discomfort of not knowing is the price of admission to truly understanding. Feynman left Brazil with a reputation as a troublemaker who didn't appreciate the students' hard work, but decades later, his critique proved prophetic. The system he exposed in Rio exists everywhere, in universities that optimize for rankings instead of learning, in professional training that produces certificates instead of competence, in online courses that sell the fantasy of easy expertise. We've built elaborate mechanisms for avoiding the hard work of actual learning, while maintaining perfect appearances. We've created a world where you can have all the credentials and none of the capability, where you can study for years and understand nothing. But we've also proven Feynman right about the solution. The students who break through share one trait. They refuse to pretend. They don't hide behind memorized definitions. They test themselves ruthlessly. They admit what they don't understand and stay in that discomfort until clarity emerges. They ask why until they reach bedrock. They explain concepts to themselves out loud. They seek problems they can't solve and refuse to look at answers until they've genuinely struggled. They know the difference between "I've seen this before" and "I understand this deeply." That difference, between recognition and understanding, between memory and mastery, is what Feynman illuminated in that Brazilian classroom 70 years ago. The crisis he exposed never ended. It just evolved better disguises, which means the question he left hanging in Rio still waits for each of us. Are you learning, or are you just memorizing? Do you understand, or do you just recognize? Can you use what you know, or only repeat it? The next time you feel certain you've learned something, try Feynman's test. Close the resources. Explain it to an empty room. Apply it to a situation you've never seen before. See what happens when you're forced to think instead of recall. That's where real knowledge begins, in the uncomfortable gap between what you thought you knew and what you can actually do. Feynman showed his Brazilian students that gap. Some chose to bridge it. Most chose to ignore it. The choice remains yours.
You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about thinking. Not in some abstract philosophical way, but in a practical sense. How do we actually know when we understand something? Because here's the strange thing. Most of us walk around believing we understand things that we don't really understand at all. Let me tell you what I mean. A few years ago, I was at a dinner party, and someone asked me to explain how a refrigerator works. Now, I'm a physicist. I should know this, right? So I started talking about thermodynamics, heat pumps, compression cycles, all the technical stuff. And then I stopped myself mid-sentence because I realized something uncomfortable. I was using words I knew, sure, but I wasn't actually explaining anything. I was just reciting. If that person had been a child or someone with no background in physics, they would have been completely lost. And that bothered me. It bothered me because I had confused knowing the name of something with knowing the thing itself. This happens all the time. We learn vocabulary. We learn formulas. We learn to recognize patterns. And we mistake all of that for understanding. But understanding is something different. Understanding is what's left when you take away all the fancy words. So I started doing something that changed the way I learn everything. I started pretending to teach. Now, I don't mean I stood in front of a classroom every time I wanted to learn something new. What I did was simpler than that. Whenever I came across an idea I wanted to really understand, I would find a blank piece of paper and I would write out an explanation as if I were teaching it to someone who knew nothing about the subject. Not another physicist, not a colleague. Someone who had never heard the word thermodynamics or momentum or entropy. A curious person with no technical background. Maybe a bright 12-year-old. And here's what happened. Every single time, without fail, I would get stuck. I'd be riding along feeling confident, and then I'd hit a spot where I'd write something like, and then the system reaches equilibrium because, and I'd stop. Because what? Why does it reach equilibrium? I thought I knew, but when I tried to explain it in plain words, I realized I didn't. I had a vague sense of it. I could use it in equations, but I couldn't explain it. That moment, that uncomfortable moment of getting stuck is the most important moment in learning. Because that's the moment when you discover the difference between what you actually understand and what you only think you understand. Most people avoid this moment. When they hit that wall, they tell themselves, well, I understand it well enough, or I don't need to know it that deeply, and they move on. But that's exactly backward. That wall is where the real learning begins. What I do when I hit that wall is simple. I go back to the source. I open the textbook again. I reread the section I thought I understood. But now I'm reading it differently. I'm not reading to collect information. I'm reading to fill in the specific gap I just discovered. I'm reading with a question in mind, and that makes all the difference. You see, the first time you learn something, you're trying to absorb everything at once. It's overwhelming. But when you go back with a specific question, why does the system reach equilibrium? You're like a detective looking for one particular clue. You read past all the stuff you already understand, and suddenly you see the sentence or paragraph that answers your question. It jumps out at you. And now you really get it because you needed it. Then I go back to my blank piece of paper and try again. And I get a little further until I hit another wall. And then I go back to the source again. And I do this over and over until I can explain the whole thing, start to finish, in simple language that anyone could follow. Now you might think this sounds tedious, and sometimes it is. But here's what I've found. It's actually faster than the way most people study. Because most people read through their textbooks or their notes multiple times, highlighting things, making flashcards, trying to memorize. They spend hours and hours, and at the end of it, they still don't really understand. They've just become better at recognizing the material when they see it. But when you use this method, when you force yourself to explain it in your own words, you're doing something much more powerful. You're not memorizing someone else's explanation. You're building your own understanding from the ground up. And that kind of understanding sticks. You don't forget it the week after the exam. It becomes part of how you think. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with physics because I think this applies to everything, not just science. Let's say you want to understand how democracy works. Not just the definition, you can look that up in 10 seconds, but really understand it. How do you do that? Well, you could read books about democracy, You could learn about the separation of powers, checks and balances, representative government, all of that, and you might feel like you understand it. But try this instead. Take out a blank piece of paper and explain to an imaginary person why democracy tends to work better than dictatorship, not using political buzzwords, not quoting the founding fathers. Just explain it in your own words, from first principles. You might start writing something like, democracy works because people vote for their leaders. Okay, but why is that better? Because then the leaders have to do what the people want. But do they? What stops them from ignoring what people want once they're elected? Well, they'll get voted out next time. But what if they change the rules so they can't be voted out? What stops them from doing that? See what's happening? You're finding the gaps. And those gaps are where the interesting questions live. Why do we need an independent judiciary? Why is freedom of the press important in a democracy? Why do we need peaceful transitions of power? These aren't just abstract ideas, they're solutions to specific problems that you discover when you try to build up the concept from scratch. And when you go back and read about democracy now, after you've struggled with these questions yourself, everything makes sense in a way it didn't before. You're not just memorizing facts about democracy. You understand why it's structured the way it is. This is what I mean by the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing the thing itself. Knowing the name is easy. Knowing the thing requires work. But it's the kind of work that actually gets you somewhere. Now, there's another piece to this that I think is crucial. When you're explaining something in simple language, you can't hide behind jargon. Jargon is useful. Sometimes it's a shorthand that lets experts communicate efficiently. But it's also a trap, because it lets you fool yourself into thinking you understand something when you're just familiar with the words. I'll give you an example from my own field. In quantum mechanics, we talk about wave function collapse. Students learn this term. They use it in equations. They can pass exams on it. But ask them to explain what it actually means, what's really happening physically, and most of them can't, because they've learned to use the term without ever building a real mental model of what it represents. The same thing happens in every field. In medicine, doctors talk about idiopathic conditions. Do you know what idiopathic means? It means we don't know what causes it. But it sounds much more impressive than saying we don't know. In business, people talk about synergy and optimization and leveraging core competencies. What do those phrases actually mean? Often, nothing very specific. They're just comfortable words that let you avoid the hard work of precise thinking. When you force yourself to explain something without jargon, you can't do that. You have to actually understand what's going on. And if you can't explain it simply, that's a sign. It's a sign that you don't understand it as well as you think you do. Now, I should tell you, this is humbling. When I first started doing this seriously, I was shocked at how many things I thought I understood but actually didn't. I'm a physicist. I've won awards. I've taught at universities. And yet, when I sat down and tried to explain basic concepts in simple language, I found holes in my understanding all over the place. But that's good. That's the point. The goal isn't to feel smart. The goal is to actually be competent. And competence comes from being honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't. There's something else I've noticed about this way of learning. When you understand something deeply enough to explain it simply, you start to see connections you didn't see before. You start to notice that the same basic principles show up in different contexts. The way a refrigerator works isn't really all that different from how an air conditioner works or how a heat engine works. They're all just moving energy around using the same basic ideas. And once you really understand those basic ideas, you can figure out new situations without having to memorize every specific case. This is what people mean when they talk about first principles thinking, though I don't love that phrase because it sounds fancier than it is. It's just understand the basics really well and everything else gets easier. I used to have students come to me and say, "Professor Feynman, I've read this chapter 3 times and I still don't get it." And I would ask them, "Have you tried writing out your own explanation?" Usually they hadn't. They thought reading was learning. But reading is just the first step. Understanding comes from engaging with the material, wrestling with it, trying to reconstruct it in your own mind. Sometimes they'd say, "But I don't know enough to explain it yet." And I'd tell them, that's exactly why you should try to explain it. Because trying to explain it is how you find out what you don't know. You don't wait until you understand something to explain it. You explain it in order to understand it. It's like the old saying, you don't really know something until you can teach it. But I'd go further than that. You don't really know something until you can teach it to someone who doesn't already speak your language, who doesn't already share your assumptions. That's the test. And here's what I find beautiful about this. It works for everything, not just academic subjects. You can use this to understand how your car works, or how the economy works, or how your relationship with your spouse works. Anything that's worth understanding is worth trying to explain in simple terms. Let me tell you about one more thing I've noticed. When you explain things this way, you often end up with an explanation that's different from the textbook. Not wrong, just different. You come at it from a different angle, use different analogies, emphasize different aspects, and that's fine. In fact, that's better than fine, because that explanation is yours. You built it. You understand why every piece is there, because you put it there yourself. This is the opposite of what most education does. Most education tries to give you someone else's understanding, already packaged and complete. Read this. Memorize that. Here's how to think about it. But understanding doesn't transfer that way. You can't just download someone else's understanding into your brain. You have to build your own. Think about it this way. If I wanted to teach you how to cook, I could give you recipes. I could tell you exactly what ingredients to use, exactly what temperature, exactly how long to cook it. And if you followed my instructions precisely, you'd probably make something decent. But you wouldn't really know how to cook. Because the first time something went wrong, you didn't have one of the ingredients, or your oven runs hot, or you wanted to make twice as much, you'd be lost. But if instead I taught you about how heat changes proteins, how salt enhances flavors, how fat carries aromatics, how acid balances richness, if I taught you the principles, then you could figure things out yourself. You could improvise. You could create. You wouldn't need my recipes anymore. That's what this method of learning does. It teaches you the principles. It forces you to understand how things actually work, not just what steps to follow. And here's the thing. This isn't just useful for learning subjects. It's useful for living, because life constantly throws situations at you that aren't in any textbook. New problems, unexpected challenges, things you've never seen before. And if you've spent your life memorizing other people's solutions, you're not prepared for that. But if you've spent your life understanding how to think things through from the ground up, if you've practiced breaking things down and building them back up in your own words, then you can handle novelty. You can figure things out. I think this is really what education should be about. Not filling people's heads with facts, not training them to pass tests, but teaching them how to think, how to question, how to understand, how to be honest with themselves about what they know and what they don't. And it starts with something as simple as a blank piece of paper and a willingness to admit that you might not understand something as well as you thought. That's all it takes. That willingness to be wrong, to be incomplete, to be still learning. Because here's the secret. We're all still learning. Every one of us. The smartest person in the world is still confused about most things. The difference is just that some of us admit it, and some of us pretend we're not. I spent my whole life being confused. Still am. But I've learned to be comfortable with that confusion because I know it's temporary. I know that if I sit down with a blank piece of paper and work through it step by step in simple language, eventually it'll make sense. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but eventually. That's the real lesson here, I think. Understanding isn't magic. It's not something you're born with or without. It's just work. Patient, humble, honest work. Trying to explain something, finding where you get stuck, going back, trying again, over and over until it clicks. And when it does click, when you finally really understand something, when you can explain it clearly and simply, when you can see all the way through it, that's one of the best feelings in the world. Not because it makes you special, but because it means you've done something real. You've added something to yourself. You've grown, and you can do that with anything, at any age. You never stop being able to learn. You just have to be willing to pick up that blank piece of paper and start writing.
Now think about the last thing you tried to learn. Maybe it was for work. Maybe it was a new skill. Maybe it was something you read in a book or watched in a video. Got it. Good. Now answer me this, can you explain it to a 10-year-old?
Yes.
Okay, let that question hang, open your eyes. If you hesitated, if you thought, well, maybe, sort of, I think so, then here's the hard truth. You don't actually understand it, and that's okay. Because today, I'm going to teach you the exact trick Richard Feynman used to become one of the greatest minds in physics. The same trick that helped him win a Nobel Prize. The same trick that made him legendary for being able to explain the most complex concepts in ways that anyone could understand. And here's the beautiful part. You can use this trick today, right now, on anything. Hey, pause, smile, I know what you're thinking. Another learning hack, another productivity tip, another thing that sounds great but doesn't actually work. But this is different, because this isn't about tricks or shortcuts. This is about understanding how your brain actually works and then working with it, not against it. So let me tell you a story. It's 1961. Feynman is at Caltech, already a famous physicist, and a student approaches him with a question. Professor Feynman, the student says, can you explain why spin 1/2 particles obey Fermi-Dirac statistics? Now, this is a standard quantum mechanics question. Any physics professor could rattle off the answer. There's an equation, there's a derivation, there's a textbook explanation. Feynman pauses, he thinks, and then he says something unexpected. I'll prepare a freshman lecture on it. The student is confused. A freshman lecture for an advanced quantum mechanics concept. But Feynman is serious. He goes away to prepare. Slow down here. A few days later, Feynman comes back, and he says, you know what? I couldn't do it. I couldn't reduce it to freshman level, which means we don't really understand it. All right, let that land let me repeat that. A Nobel Prize winning physicist, one of the smartest humans who ever lived, just admitted that he didn't really understand something. Not because he couldn't do the math, not because he didn't know the equations, but because he couldn't explain it simply. And in that moment, Feynman articulated something profound. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it. This became his standard, his test, his trick, and it changed everything. I walk across stage. Let me ask you something. How do most people learn? They read something, they highlight it. Maybe they take notes. They tell themselves, okay, I've got it. And then they move on. Or maybe they're more diligent. They read it twice. They make flashcards. They review the material. They memorize key points. And you know what? They still don't understand it. Because here's what nobody tells you: reading is not learning. Memorizing is not understanding. Let me prove it to you. Point to audience eye. How many of you have read a book, gotten to the end and thought, that was great? And then a week later, someone asked you what it was about and you can barely remember. Pause for recognition. Yeah, all of us? Or how many of you have sat through a presentation, nodded along, understood everything in the moment, and then walked out completely unable to explain what you just learned? More recognition. This is the illusion of knowledge, and it's everywhere. Your brain is a lying liar that lies to you. It tells you that you understand things when you don't. It confuses familiarity with comprehension. It mistakes recognition for knowledge. Feynman understood this. He understood that most of what we think we know, we don't actually know. We just know the words. We know the surface. We know enough to fool ourselves, get intense. And this is why people stay stuck. They read all the books. They take all the courses. They consume all the content. And they never actually learn anything because they never test their understanding. They never expose the gaps. They never do the hard work of actually thinking. But Feynman had a solution. All right, let me break this down for you. The Feynman technique. 4 simple steps that will revolutionize the way you learn. Start to count on fingers. Step 1 and choose a concept you want to learn. Anything, literally anything. Quantum physics, marketing, cooking, relationships. Doesn't matter. Pick something you want to understand. Step 2, teach it to a child. Not actually to a child, though you could, but pretend you're teaching it to a 12-year-old, or your grandmother, or someone who knows absolutely nothing about the topic. And here's the key: use simple language, no jargon, no technical terms, no shortcuts. If you want to explain how an engine works, you can't just say combustion chamber and move on. You have to explain what combustion is, what a chamber is, why it matters. Step 3, identify gaps and go back to the source material. This is where it gets interesting, because when you try to explain something simply, you will get stuck, guaranteed. You'll hit a point where you realize, wait, I don't actually understand this part. Akaspaza, that moment, that's gold. That's where learning happens. Because now you know exactly what you don't understand. You're not fooling yourself anymore. You've exposed the gap. So you go back. You study that specific part. You break it down. You figure it out. Step 4, simplify and use analogies. Once you understand it, make it even simpler. Use analogies. Use metaphors. Use stories. Because if you can connect new information to something people already understand, they'll get it instantly. Thar snap fingers ersa like that. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds nice, but why does this actually work? A fair question. Let me tell you what's happening in your brain. Or get excited about this. When you read something, your brain creates a very shallow neural pathway. It's like walking through tall grass once, you barely make a trail. But when you try to explain it, when you struggle to find the words, when you reorganize the information in your own way, your brain has to work. It has to fire multiple neural pathways. It has to connect different areas. It's like walking through that grass 50 times. You create a highway. This is called elaborative rehearsal in neuroscience. And it's the most effective way to create long-term memories and deep understanding. But there's more. When you identify gaps, when you get stuck trying to explain something, your brain enters a state of productive confusion. And research shows this is actually optimal for learning. Because your brain is like, oh crap, I thought I knew this, but I don't. I need to pay attention now. Lean and Feynman. And here's the really cool part. When you finally figure it out, when you fill that gap and suddenly understand, your brain releases dopamine. You get a hit of pleasure, a reward. Your brain literally rewards you for learning. And what do we do when we get rewarded? We want to do it again. This is why Feynman loved learning. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity. It felt good. Let me tell you how Feynman actually used this in his life. Far share this story with energy. There's this famous story about Feynman at Los Alamos during World War II. They're building the atomic bomb. The stakes couldn't be higher. And there are all these young scientists, brilliant people, working on incredibly complex problems. But they're stuck. They're making mistakes. They're confused. So Feynman starts teaching them. Not lecturing, teaching. He breaks everything down to first principles. He uses simple language. He draws pictures. He makes analogies. And suddenly people start understanding. Not just memorizing formulas, but actually understanding what they're doing and why. One of his colleagues later said, Feynman didn't just know physics. He understood it so deeply that he could make anyone else understand it too. That's the power of this technique. Another example. After Feynman won the Nobel Prize, he got depressed. Yeah, seriously, because physics wasn't fun anymore. It had become work. It had become about reputation and publishing and being serious. So you know what he did? He started playing again. He'd watch a plate wobble in the cafeteria and think, I wonder why it wobbles that way. And then he'd work out the equations. Not because he had to, not because someone asked him to, but because he was curious. And he'd explain it to himself as if he were teaching it to a child. Okay, so when the plate spins, the centrifugal force does this, which causes this wobble, which creates this pattern. From that play, from that childlike curiosity and simple explanation, came some of his most important work on quantum electrodynamics. The work that won him the Nobel Prize started as play, and it started with simple explanations. As I get into teaching mode. Okay, enough theory. Let's get practical. How do you actually do this? Let's say you want to learn about compound interest. Basic financial concept, right? Everyone says compound interest is important. You've heard it a million times. But do you actually understand it? Let's test it using the Feynman technique. Step 1, you pick your concept. Compound interest. Step 2, you explain it to a child. Okay, so imagine you have $100, and you put it in a special piggy bank that gives you $10 extra every year. Cool, right? So after 1 year, you have $110. But here's where it gets interesting. In year 2, you don't just get $10 again. You get $10 on your original $100, plus you get $1 extra on the $10 you earned last year. So now you have $121. And every year, you earn money not just on what you started with, but on all the money you've earned along the way. So your money grows faster and faster. But see what I just did? I didn't use the word principle. I didn't use the word interest rate. I didn't use a formula. I used a piggy bank and simple numbers. Step 3. Identify gaps. Maybe you realize, wait, what if the interest rate changes? What if you take money out? What if you add money in? Great. Now you know exactly what you don't understand. Go research those specific questions. Step 4 is simplify further. Compound interest is like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts small, but as it rolls, it picks up more snow. And the bigger it gets, the more snow it picks up each time around. Eventually, you have a massive snowball. Now anyone gets it. But here's where people screw this up. Let me tell you the 3 biggest mistakes. I count them out key. Mistake number 1, using jargon as a crutch. People try to explain something, but they can't resist using technical terms. Well, it's basically a paradigm shift in the operational framework. Stop. If you're using big words, you're hiding. Feynman was famous for this. He'd stop people mid-sentence and say, "Pretend I'm your grandmother. Explain it again." And suddenly, they'd realize they didn't actually understand what they were talking about. Mistake number 2, not actually writing it down or saying it out loud. People think they can do this in their head. They can't. When you force yourself to write or speak, you expose the gaps. You can't fake it. Your brain can't skip over the hard parts. 8-point ahead so your brain will lie to you. Yeah, I understand that part. Let's move on. But when you have to write it down or say it out loud, suddenly you're like, wait, I don't actually know what happens next. Mistake number 3, giving up too soon. This technique is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Because you're going to realize how much you don't understand. Most people hit that discomfort and quit. They think, this is too hard. I'm not smart enough. Wrong. You're just finally seeing the truth. And that's where the real learning begins. Get encouraging. Push through. Embrace the confusion. That's your brain building new pathways. Now let me tell you one of Feynman's secrets within the secret. Analogies. This is what separated Feynman from other physicists. He was a master of analogies. I share examples. Someone asks him to explain quantum electrodynamics. Impossible to explain, right? It's one of the most complex theories in physics. Feynman explains it like this. Imagine you're playing catch in the dark. You can't see the ball, but you know someone threw it because you caught it. That's kind of like how particles interact. We can't see the interaction itself, but we see the results. Is that technically perfect? No, but does it give you a foothold to start understanding? Absolutely. Or take his famous explanation of why ice is slippery. Most scientists would talk about pressure, induced phase transitions, and reduced friction coefficients. Feynman said, imagine you're walking on ball bearings. That's basically what's happening. There's a thin layer of liquid water acting like tiny rolling balls under your feet. Gesture. Instant understanding. Here's why analogies work so well. Your brain learns by connecting new information to things it already knows. If you give your brain a bridge, it's like this thing I already understand. It crosses that bridge instantly. Without analogies, you're asking your brain to build understanding from scratch. With analogies, you're giving it a shortcut to comprehension. And this is key for the Feynman technique. When you're explaining something, always ask yourself, what is this like? What does this remind me of? Here's something wild that Feynman discovered. The best way to learn something is to teach it. Sounds backwards, right? How can you teach something you don't know? But that's exactly the point. Get philosophical. When you position yourself as a teacher, even if you're just teaching yourself or an imaginary child, something shifts in your brain. You become responsible for the information. You can't just passively absorb it. You have to actively organize it, structure it, translate it. There's this concept in psychology called the protégé effect. Studies show that students who prepare to teach material to others learn it more thoroughly than students who just study it for themselves. Why? Because when you're going to teach something, you think differently. You ask, what's the core idea here? What are the most important parts? What would confuse people? How do I make this clear? Point out P. Those are the questions that lead to deep understanding. Feynman knew this intuitively. That's why he loved teaching. Not because he wanted to show off how smart he was, though he could be a bit of a showman, but because teaching forced him to understand things at a deeper level. He once said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level. That means we really don't understand it. We don't understand it because we can't teach it. That's the standard. That's the bar. All right, let me give you the formula. The exact process you can use right now to learn anything. Present this as a clear system. First, consume the material. Read it, watch it, listen to it. Second, close the book or video. No peeking. Third, get a blank sheet of paper. Fourth, write at the top how I would explain this topic to a 12-year-old. Fifth, write or speak your explanation. No jargon. Simple words only. Sixth, circle every point where you got stuck. Seventh, go back to the source and study only those parts. Eighth, repeat steps 3 through 7 until you can explain it without getting stuck. Ninth, add analogies to make it even clearer. 10th, test yourself by explaining it to someone else or by recording yourself. Emphasize this as, that's it. 10 steps? You can do this in 20 minutes for a simple concept, an hour for something complex, a few sessions for something really difficult. But here's the magic. After you do this, you'll understand that concept better than 99% of people who studied it, because most people never expose their gaps. They never test their understanding. They convince themselves they know something when they don't. You'll actually know it. Let me show you how this works in different areas of life. Go through examples for students. Stop highlighting textbooks. Stop making flashcards that just have definitions. Instead, after each chapter, close the book. Write how I would explain this chapter to my younger sibling. When you get stuck, that's what you need to study. I promise you, 1 hour of Feynman technique study beats 10 hours of passive reading. For professionals, after meetings, after reading reports, after training sessions, take 5 minutes. Explain to yourself what you just learned as if you're explaining it to someone outside your industry. This does 2 things. First, you actually retain the information. Second, you'll be able to explain your work to anyone, which makes you incredibly valuable. For creatives, want to understand why certain stories work, why certain designs are effective, why certain music moves people. Use the Feynman technique. Break it down. Explain it simply. Find the principles underneath the surface. For parents, your kids ask you why the sky is blue. Instead of giving them a complicated answer or brushing them off, use this as a learning opportunity for yourself. Try to explain it simply. If you can't, look it up, learn it, then explain it to them. You'll both learn. And you'll teach them that it's okay not to know something. What matters is the curiosity to find out. Here's where this technique becomes truly powerful. It doesn't just help you learn specific things. It teaches you how to think. Get excited. This is what Feynman really understood. The technique isn't just about memorizing information. It's about developing metacognition. Thinking about thinking. Every time you use this technique, you're practicing self-awareness, recognizing what you don't know. You're practicing critical thinking, analyzing and breaking down concepts. You're practicing communication, translating complex ideas. You're practicing pattern recognition, finding analogies and connections. And you're practicing intellectual honesty, admitting gaps in understanding, all pausing. These are the skills that make you genuinely smart. Not knowing a lot of facts, anyone can Google facts. But being able to think clearly, learn quickly, and understand deeply, that's real intelligence. And here's the beautiful part. The more you use this technique, the better you get at it, the faster you identify gaps, the more easily you create analogies, the more naturally you think in first principles. Feynman used this technique for decades, and it became second nature to him. He couldn't help but break things down simply. He couldn't help but question until he understood. It became who he was, and it can become who you are too. So here's what I want you to do right now. Today, direct challenge. Pick one thing. Just one. Something you think you understand, but you've never really tested. Maybe it's something from your job. Maybe it's a concept you learned in school. Maybe it's something you read in a book recently. Got it. Now, here's your challenge. Explain it to someone who knows nothing about it. Actually do it. Don't just think about doing it. Find someone, a friend, a family member, a colleague, and explain it to them. Or if you can't do that, write it out. Record yourself. But actually externalize your understanding. Hey, lean in, and here's what's going to happen. You're going to get stuck. You're going to realize you don't understand it as well as you thought. And that moment, that uncomfortable, slightly embarrassing moment, that's when the magic starts. because now you know exactly what you need to learn. Now you can stop wasting time on things you already understand and focus on the gaps. This is efficient learning. This is smart learning. And this is how Feynman learned, and it's how you can learn too. But let me tell you something deeper, something Feynman understood that goes beyond just learning facts. Get philosophical and slow down, P. This technique isn't just about learning. It's about humility. Every time you use the Feynman technique, you're forced to confront your own ignorance. You're forced to admit what you don't know. And in a world where everyone is pretending to be an expert, where everyone is projecting confidence, even when they're confused, that's radical. Feynman once said, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." At pause, we are all fooling ourselves about something. We all have areas where we think we understand, but we don't. We all have beliefs we've never examined. We all have knowledge that's actually just memorized words without understanding. This technique is a tool for intellectual honesty, for seeing yourself clearly, for having the courage to say, "I don't actually understand this." And that courage, that's what separates average minds from great minds. Average minds protect their ego. They pretend to understand. They hide behind jargon and confidence. Great minds protect their understanding. They admit confusion. They expose gaps. They learn. A direct statement, which one do you want to be? Let me leave you with one final story about Feynman. Wire tell this with emotion late in his life. Feynman was battling cancer. He was dying, and he knew it. And someone asked him what he was most proud of in his career. You'd think he'd say the Nobel Prize, or his work on the atomic bomb, or his contributions to quantum physics that changed our understanding of the universe. But you know what he said. He said he was most proud of the Feynman lectures on physics, a series of undergraduate lectures he gave at Caltech, lectures where he took the most complex topics in physics and explained them so clearly, so simply that anyone could understand.
Positive.
Why? Because those lectures represented what he believed was most important, not just understanding, but sharing that understanding, making knowledge accessible, breaking down barriers between experts and everyone else. He spent years developing those lectures, refining them, simplifying them, making them better, because he believed that if you truly understand something, you can explain it to anyone. And if you can explain it to anyone, you can change the world. ARB, look directly at audience X. That's what this technique is really about. It's not just about making you smarter. It's about making knowledge accessible. It's about breaking down the barriers between experts and normal people. It's about democratizing understanding. There's another layer to this that I need to share with you. Because when you start using this technique regularly, something interesting happens. You start to see the world differently. Walk to the other side of the stage. You stop accepting things at face value. You start questioning more. Not in an annoying, contrarian way, but in a genuine, curious way. Feynman had this quality he couldn't help but ask why. About everything. Why does water swirl down the drain in that direction? Why do mirrors reverse left and right but not up and down? Why do we shake hands as a greeting? Some people thought it was exhausting. His friends would sometimes groan when he started asking questions at dinner parties. But that curiosity, that relentless need to understand, that's what made him brilliant. And here's the thing, you can develop that same quality. The Feynman technique trains you to be curious. Because every time you try to explain something and get stuck, you're training your brain to notice gaps, to ask questions, to dig deeper. Get passionate. This changes everything. It changes how you read. It changes how you listen. It changes how you think. You stop being a passive consumer of information and become an active learner. You stop memorizing and start understanding. You stop fooling yourself and start knowing yourself. Let me give you a real example from my own life. I thought I understood how democracy worked. I voted, I read the news, I had opinions about politics. I could talk about checks and balances and separation of powers. But then I tried to explain it using the Feynman technique. I sat down and wrote how I would explain democracy to a 12-year-old, and I got stuck immediately. Why do we have an electoral college? I couldn't explain it without using circular logic. Why is the Senate structured the way it is? I realized I'd never actually thought about it. What's the actual difference between federal and state power? I knew there was a difference, but I couldn't articulate it clearly. It was humbling. Here I was a grown adult with political opinions, and I couldn't explain the basics of my own government system. So I went back. I studied. Not everything, just the specific parts where I got stuck. And then I tried again. And you know what? Now I actually understand democracy. Not perfectly, but genuinely. I can explain it to anyone. And more importantly, my political opinions are now based on actual understanding, not just inherited beliefs or media talking points. That's the power of this technique. It forces you to be honest about what you know versus what you think you know. Shift ton, a now. I want to address something that might be bothering some of you. You might be thinking, this sounds great, but I don't have time. I'm busy. I've got work, family responsibilities. I get it, we're all busy. But here's the thing, this technique doesn't take more time. It takes less time. Think about it. How much time do you waste right now reading things you forget? Sitting in meetings you don't understand? Taking courses that don't stick? Watching videos that don't teach you anything? What if instead of consuming 10 hours of content and retaining 10%, you spent 3 hours using the Feynman technique and retained 90%? Do the math gesture. That's more effective learning in less time. Feynman wasn't successful because he spent more hours studying than everyone else. He was successful because he studied more effectively. He didn't waste time fooling himself. He didn't waste time on shallow learning. He went deep, he went fast, and he moved on. And here's another secret. Once you get good at this technique, it becomes fast, really fast. When Feynman encountered a new concept, he could break it down in his head almost instantly. He'd automatically ask, how would I explain this to a kid? And if he couldn't, he'd know exactly what he needed to learn. That skill, the ability to quickly identify what you don't understand, that's a superpower. It means you never waste time studying things you already know. You never fool yourself into thinking you understand when you don't. You go straight to the gaps and fill them. I prefer point to audience, imagine having that ability. Imagine being able to look at any topic and immediately know, I understand these 3 parts, but I don't understand these 2 parts. Let me focus on those. That's efficient learning. That's what this technique gives you. Let me tell you about another time Feynman used this approach, and it's one of my favorite stories. I sure share this story with energy. Sir Feynman was once asked to serve on a committee evaluating science textbooks for California schools. He agreed, thinking it would be straightforward. Look at the books, see if they're accurate, give feedback. But when he started reading the books, he was horrified. The books were full of words, big words, scientific-sounding words. But when he tried to understand what they were actually teaching, he realized they weren't teaching anything. There was one book that had a whole chapter about energy. It defined energy. It categorized different types of energy. It used the word energy on every page. But it never explained what energy actually is. It never gave students a way to understand it, to visualize it, to connect it to their experience. Feynman tried to explain energy the way the textbook did. He couldn't. It was just circular definitions and empty terminology. So he tried explaining it his way. Energy is like money. You can't see money directly. You see dollars, coins, checks, bank accounts. Energy is the same. You can't see energy directly. You see motion, heat, light, sound. But just like you can convert dollars to coins to checks, you can convert motion to heat to light. It's all the same thing in different forms. Boom. Now a kid understands energy, but the textbook couldn't do that because whoever wrote it didn't actually understand energy deeply enough to explain it simply. And this, Feynman realized, was everywhere, in schools, in businesses, in government, people using complex language to hide simple ideas. Or worse, using complex language to hide the fact that they have no ideas at all. Get serious, this is why the Feynman technique matters. Not just for you, but for society. Because we live in a world where complexity is mistaken for intelligence, where jargon is mistaken for expertise, where confidence is mistaken for competence. And that's dangerous. When politicians use complex language to avoid explaining their policies, that's dangerous. When companies use buzzwords to avoid explaining their products, that's dangerous. When experts use jargon to avoid admitting they don't know something, that's dangerous. The Feynman technique is a weapon against that. It's a tool for cutting through bullshit. It's a standard for honesty. If someone can't explain their idea simply, they don't understand it. Period. Point directly at audience, and you have the power to hold people to that standard. When someone gives you a complicated explanation, you can say, "Can you explain that more simply?" When someone uses jargon, you can say, "Pretend I'm 12. What does that mean?" You'll be amazed how often people can't do it. And you'll be amazed how clarifying it is when they can. Now, I want to talk about something Feynman discovered that goes even deeper. He realized that understanding isn't just about breaking things down. It's also about building them up. Shift to a more thoughtful tone. See, there are two ways to learn something. You can take something complex and break it into simple parts. That's analysis. That's what we've been talking about. But you can also take simple parts and build them into something complex. That's synthesis. And that's where creativity lives. Feynman was brilliant at both. He could take quantum mechanics and break it down into simple ideas anyone could understand. But he could also take simple ideas and combine them in new ways to create breakthroughs nobody had thought of before. And the Feynman technique trains both skills. When you're trying to explain something simply, you're doing analysis. You're breaking it down, finding the core components, understanding the relationships. But when you're creating analogies, when you're connecting new information to things you already know, when you're reorganizing ideas in your own way, that's synthesis. That's creativity. Get excited. This is why people who master this technique don't just become better learners, they become better thinkers, better problem solvers, better creators. Because they can move fluidly between breaking things down and building things up. Between understanding and innovation, Feynman did this constantly. He'd learn about biology by breaking it down to first principles, and then he'd see connections to physics that biologists had missed. He'd learn about computing and see possibilities that computer scientists hadn't considered. He'd learn about art and find insights that applied to science. That's the ultimate goal here. Not just to understand individual topics, but to see connections between topics. To build a web of understanding that lets you think across disciplines, combine ideas in novel ways, solve problems nobody else can solve. And it all starts with being able to explain things simply. Let me give you one more practical example before we wrap up. And this one is personal. Get vulnerable. I used to think I was pretty good at communication. I could write, I could speak, I could present. People would tell me I explained things well. But then I started really using the Feynman technique, not just occasionally, but systematically, on everything. And I realized I wasn't as good as I thought. I was good at sounding smart. I was good at using the right words. I was good at performing knowledge. But when I tried to explain complex topics to actual 12-year-olds, I struggled. When I tried to explain my work to my family, they didn't get it. When I tried to teach something without using any technical terms, it was hard. I had been fooling myself. So I practiced. I used the technique over and over, on my work, on things I read, on ideas I had, everything. And slowly, I got better. Not just at explaining things, but at understanding them. My thinking became clearer. My work became better. My conversations became deeper. Look at audience ease. And here's what I want you to understand. If you're not regularly testing your understanding by trying to explain things simply, you're probably fooling yourself too. We all are. It's human nature. But you can change that today, right now. All you have to do is commit to using this technique. Not once, not occasionally, but as a regular practice. Every time you learn something new, explain it simply. Every time you think you understand something, test that understanding by teaching it. Every time you hear complex language, challenge it by asking for simple explanation. Make it a habit. Make it a standard. Make it who you are. So here's what I want you to remember. Or slow down. Make this powerful. You are capable of understanding anything, literally anything, if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to break it down, if you're willing to expose your gaps and fill them. The Feynman technique isn't magic. It's just a systematic way of doing what great learners have always done. Question, simplify, and test understanding. But it works. God, does it work? I've seen it transform students who were failing into students who excel. I've seen it help professionals master new skills in a fraction of the usual time. I've seen it give people confidence they never had before, because they genuinely understand things now instead of just memorizing them. And I know it can work for you too. I found a final challenge. So here's my challenge to you. One more time, use this technique once. Just once. On one topic. See what happens. Pick something you think you understand. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be important. Just something. And then sit down with a blank piece of paper. Write at the top how I would explain this to a 12-year-old and write or speak or record yourself. Whatever works for you. And when you get stuck, and you will get stuck, don't give up. That's where the learning is. Go back to the source. Figure out that specific part. And try again. Do this for 20 minutes. That's all. 20 minutes. I promise you, those 20 minutes will teach you more about learning than a semester of traditional study. And maybe, just maybe, it will change the way you approach learning forever. Of our smile, because that's what happened to Feynman. He discovered this approach early in his life, and it became his superpower. It's why he could master any topic he set his mind to. It's why he could explain the most complex concepts to anyone. It's why he won a Nobel Prize. Not because he was born smarter than everyone else, but because he learned how to learn. And now you know his secret. I walk to center stage a thank you. and hey, if this resonated with you, if you're excited to start learning like Feynman learned, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to the Mind of Richard Feynman channel. Because we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore about how Feynman thought, how he learned, how he approached problems that everyone else thought were impossible. We're going to dive into his other techniques, his approach to problem solving, his strategies for staying curious, his methods for thinking clearly. Join us. Let's learn together. Let's think together. Let's become the kind of people who don't just consume information, but truly understand it.